Hello, and welcome back to the Alexander Society, a podcast where we get COVID and can't do any podcast stuff for like 2 to 3 weeks.
I think it was 3 weeks.
Yeah, I was out of commission for 2 weeks, and I spent another week trying to catch back up on research. Oh my God, that sucked. Man, that was not fun to go through.
Uh, I can't imagine it was any fun at all.
Well, how have you been in our little hiatus?
Not bad. Falling into work a lot, hating life, the usual.
Yeah, just normal stuff. The reason we made a podcast as an excuse to drink.
Exactly.
So, this is a podcast about history and also drinking, as you probably already know if you're actually like listening this far in.
Giving a damn.
Yeah, giving a damn. Which thank you, by the way. I appreciate that.
We care for all of your dams you give.
So, Tim, what are you drinking tonight?
So I decided to get the Simply Spiked they're doing. So it's basically like spiked lemonade from Simply. I heard they're delicious. And then I went to a liquor store and picked up a new tequila. It is called Cimarron. It's a silver tequila. And it's got I think it's a ram on it.
That's fun. So, what I got for my shots, I can't remember if I've done this one on the show before or not, but it's a Jamaican rum. It's called Appleton Estate. Just nothing fancy about it. Just good smooth rum. I really enjoy it.
Is it like I know you went through something similar for like several episodes.
Um, I don't think it was. No, the one I was doing before was Plantation, which I still have probably like 4 shots left in this bottle actually.
Okay.
But for my sipper, I just picked out a random beer at the store, and this one wasn't an IPA, so I went ahead and grabbed it.
That was your only qualification, not an IPA.
Literally my only qualification. It's called Revolver Brewing. It's an ale.
Ales are solid.
This one's called Blood and Honey.
That sounds delicious.
Yeah, it's brewed with blood orange peel, Texas honey, and spices, is what it says.
Nice.
Which I'm actually kind of excited to try this. This actually looks really good.
Let me know what you think. I might pick up some of that.
Yeah. Anyways, so on this, our podcast, in our illustrious organization, we have a set of rules that we abide by when we discuss things from history. Rule number 1: we take a shot at the start of every episode. So let's go ahead and do that.
Still a hack and a fraud, I see, not getting your shot ready at a time.
Oh, well, excuse me. I don't even have anything to clap back with. It's just, you're right, and I don't want to admit it. All right. Tim, what's rule number 2?
Oh, I thought we were going to do a cheers or something.
Oh, my bad.
Oh, crap. I did that wrong. If there's an event in the story where someone dies, take a sip.
No, rule number 3. If we mention someone who was in a previous episode, we take a sip. And by previous episode, I mean like a previous topic.
Gotta say on that tequila, it is, I wouldn't say bland, but very mild. I kind of like it. It could also be because it's just fresh out of the freezer. If alcohol is mentioned, take a sip.
Yeah, I noticed it's weird that it does that to alcohol. If you keep alcohol in a freezer and you just drink it like right out of the freezer, it kind of dampens the flavor for some reason.
It does that to all alcohol. It's I think it's got to do something with the movement of the molecules.
Molecules. See, I'm the history guy, not the science guy. I know movement of molecules has vaguely something to do with heat. I couldn't tell you what though.
I'm just quoting something I vaguely remember from YouTube. They talked about why if you're really a whiskey person, you'll drink at room temperature because you get all the flavors that are supposed to be there.
Yeah, that makes sense. Anyways, rule number 5. If there's an event in the script where someone dies and alcohol is involved, we take a shot. And then I guess, a new tradition that we're starting now. For every new topic, we're going to introduce some extra rules on top of our basic rules. So I'm going to go ahead and list out the rules for this particular topic. First one is every time someone religious does something weird, we take a shot. The second one is every time someone moves west, we take a sip. And the third one, every time someone has a weird name, we take a shot. Before we hop into the topic, I wanted to ask you something real quick, just to test your knowledge a little bit.
What's up, dude?
There have been four, arguably five, states in the history of the United States that hold the distinction of having been an independent country prior to their inclusion as an American state. Can you name any of them?
I know there was Texas, California, and that's all I can name off right off my head.
Yeah, Texas and California are the two famous ones. They're both products of like Anglo American rebellions against the Mexican government. Uh, Third one was Hawaii, which in its
I should have known that one because I remember we basically stole Hawaii because of the sugar.
not actually, it wasn't about the sugar. It was about pineapples. It was literally a coup d'état prompted and organized by fruit companies.
Interesting. I always thought it was the sugar industry that was like, oh, we have all this set up here. We have to take control of the government because we're greedy bastards.
It's it what it the actual product that they're doing it for is kind of immaterial. They were doing it to exploit the land and the labor of the Hawaiian people.
Yeah, we kind of had the same idea. They just did it to exploit people. What product it was didn't matter.
Yeah. By the way, don't go on vacation to Hawaii. The native Hawaiians have repeatedly said, "Don't go on vacation to Hawaii. You're destroying their islands." Uh, le-
Yeah, it makes total sense. Like that tourist industry is a trap.
Anyways, figured I'd throw that out there while the topic was up. The fourth example of a state that had an independent government prior to becoming an American state was interestingly Oregon, which it was called Oregon, like the Oregon government, but it also included Washington, Idaho, and parts of Wyoming and Montana. And also, it's the closest that we've had that the American continent has ever had to like an actual existing like racist ethno state,
I'm not surprised.
like actual practicing ethno state where they forbid people who were not white from even existing within its borders. So yeah, that's another interesting fact just to bring up while we're on the topic. The fifth one is if you're from New England, you probably know about it, but if you're not, you've never heard this before in your life. The very first, what was prior an independent country that eventually became a state in the United States was the 14th state, the first state to be included after the original 13 colonies, which was the Vermont Republic.
That makes total sense. To be perfectly honest, uh, those states right there would kind of already develop after the 13 colonies, and just next one up. Oh yeah, here we go.
Vermont is a state that's nestled right between the states of New Hampshire to its east and New York to its west. And then it shares a northern border with Canada. And today's topic is going to be about the man who founded the state and first the Republic of Vermont, which is a guy named Ethan Allen, who doesn't seem like he'd be super interesting because he's like by today's perspective like a minor character in the American Revolution, but at the time was an enormous deal and had a fascinating life. And I'm so excited to talk about him.
I've never even heard of him.
Yeah, he. I think I mentioned the Green Mountain Boys to you once before.
I think you vaguely did, yeah.
Yeah, he was the government of the Vermont Republic was formed out of the militia that he founded. That was called the Green Mountain Boys. We'll get to that. That was actually a real
That sounds like something you'd hear today. New white supremacist group, the Green
Green
Mountain
Mountain
Boys.
Boys. Yeah. So the sources I'm using for today's topic are two books: Ethan Allen, His Life and Times by Willard Stern Randall, which is a little bit more sympathetic towards him. And the other book is Those Turbulent Sons of Freedom, Ethan Allen's Green Mountain Boys and the American Revolution by Christopher Wren, which is a little bit not quite critical of him, but like it less deifies him, if that makes sense. And then another source that I actually used for this, as a little bit of like background information, is a video from a YouTube channel called Atun Shea Films, which is a fantastic channel. Everybody should go and check it out. He did a video called In Defense of Puritanism, which had a lot of really interesting information about like the political and theological and social organization of Puritanism and how that affected the development of New England. So, without further ado, let's get into this. To understand the world in which Ethan Allen was born, we have to understand a little bit about Puritanism. People have a lot of ideas about what Puritanism is here in the US. Either they see Puritans as these dour conservative buzzkills who are always wearing boring, simple clothing and hated music and laughter and always shouted witch at every shadow, or they see them as pilgrims who fled religious persecution in England and founded the quote unquote city on a hill in the New World, and as a result, introduced many of the cultural values which were central to the establishment of the United States. Both of these interpretations have a little bit of truth to them, but they're also both really, really wrong. That's not because they're incorrect, but it's because they both downplay the positive and the negative aspects of Puritan beliefs.
Makes sense.
Yeah. Puritans had a lot of really weird beliefs. On one of their central tenets was a piece of theology that they inherited from a branch of German Protestantism, which was called Calvinism. And it was this idea of predestination. Predestination was the idea that whether a person was going to heaven or hell was decided by God before they were even born. And so it didn't matter what you did in life. God has already decided where you're going by the time you're born, and so it literally doesn't.
So that sounds a lot more simplified than I know predestination to, like the definition I know.
It's yeah, it's a lot more complicated than that, obviously, but that's the basic summary of it as I understand it.
Okay.
Um, People who were thought to be destined to going to heaven were referred to as the elect, and you could tell who was elect because when they're alive they demonstrate like deep piety and they have great affluence and they have a high social status. Basically, in Puritan communities, if you went to the meeting hall on Sunday and you said all the right things and you were rich, you were basically a living saint. It was literally just a popularity thing. If people liked you, you were going to heaven. If people didn't like you, you're going to hell. But don't call them saints because they thought saints were paganistic.
Of course they did.
Yeah, they did. Which brings me to my next point. The Puritans really hated Catholics. Hate Nobody has hated anybody more than Puritans hated Catholics. Hating the Roman Church wasn't exactly uncommon in 17th century England. During that century, they overthrew multiple monarchs because they thought that these monarchs were secretly Catholics. But the Puritans took it to a whole other level. They legitimately thought that the Pope was the active servant of the devil, and that the purpose of the Catholic Church and its clergy was to lead the masses into Satan's arms. Every time there was conflict or a political scandal, or if somebody looked at them like they're a bunch of weirdos, they would just start throwing around accusations of heresy and witchcraft and calling people papists. That was a really popular insult they love to use, is calling people a papist. They even did this with the Church of England, which they saw as too Catholic because the Anglicans still had priests and used prayer books. Like, they thought that priests that were appointed by bishops was an affront to God's uh, the way to have a relationship with God, which was a very personal thing to them. And they saw prayer books as heretical because they thought that the only book that you needed was the scripture, was the Bible.
Damn.
And so the political repression that they were escaping when they fled to the New World was really caused by the fact that they kept calling people Catholic and pissing them off. They just couldn't fit in with a society that they thought was being run by Satan himself. And so they ended up leaving, or a portion of them did. But all of their eccentricities conflict with another really strange aspect of their beliefs. You could definitely say that they were religious fanatics and zealots, but you definitely couldn't say that they were conservative, not by a long shot. In fact, from a political standpoint, you could make an argument that they were the single most radical force in 17th century England. They hated the monarchy, they hated the nobility, and they hated the authority of the English government. They believed in self sufficient communities of true believers that met in central meeting halls to decide on policy for their town through face to face discussion, a process called town hall democracy or direct democracy. One branch of Puritans, I love this topic. It's so interesting. And I'd love to go more in depth in this sometime. But for the moment, I'll just give a brief little thing about it. One branch of Puritans, a movement called the Diggers, was led by a theologian and activist named Gerard Winstanley. This movement, the Diggers, have been referred to by scholars and historians as proto communists or anarchists.
Interesting.
They believe that all land and the fruit of the land was granted by God to all people equally, and that private ownership of land, as well as the power and privileges that came with private property, was heretical and an affront to God's will that all people be equal.
Sounds like they had it down.
That they, yeah, they were using scripture to come up with the exact same ideas that the socialist movement would be writing down in more academic terms, like 200 years later.
I mean, I don't agree with a lot of religious stuff, but right there, it sounds like, yeah, that part.
Yeah, that's pretty neat. And I wish they'd been a little bit more militant so they could have actually accomplished anything. But for the 2 years that they were around, it was pretty neat. Um, the Puritans who settled in New England weren't quite that radical, but they were still radical enough to be seen with distrust by the crown. As they settled in the harsh New England frontier, they rejected the practice of large landholdings that other colonies were practicing and instead built communities of small single family farms that encircled a central town with a congregation meeting hall where community decisions were made. And granted, big asterisk here before you start talking about how cool this is. Keep in mind they were doing all of this while also waging multiple genocidal wars and displacements of native peoples.
No, I was only praising that one part of them.
Yeah, yeah. So I don't want people to think that like I thought the Puritans were in New England were good or anything. I just want to make sure that's there. So some of these early settlers were the congregation of a firebrand preacher and a social critic named Thomas Hooker. His denunciations of the decadent Stuart dynasty, which was leading England at the time, that led him to become a target of King James I's religious crackdowns, which prompted him and his flock to flee first to Holland and then from there to the newly established Massachusetts Bay Colony. Somebody moved west. Let's go ahead and take a sip. So, amongst this group of Thomas Hooker's congregation that landed in Boston in 1633, there were three brothers amongst them: Thomas Allen, Matthew Allen, and Samuel Allen. Samuel Allen was the great great grandfather of today's topic, Ethan Allen. At the time, the Puritan authorities of Massachusetts were limiting voting in the colony to those who, like, they would do an interview. Members of the clergy would do an interview with people just getting off the boats to determine like how faithful they were, and if they decided that you were faithful enough, then you would be allowed to vote.
Yeah, sure. That's just how you keep people voting exactly how you want.
Yeah, yeah, that's exactly. Yeah, you could see like almost immediately all of like the cool, interesting beliefs that the Puritans had were being subsumed into their more ridiculous, insane beliefs just for political convenience. That's going to be a common theme through this story, actually. Hooker disagreed with this policy. He believed that the vote should be extended to all the men in a community, regardless of the government's personal opinions of them. Again, I've got to make the point: all of the men in the community, not the women. Just throwing that out there, but
You got to add in the sexism.
yeah, I want to make sure that all of I completely cover. Like, I don't want to give the impression that Puritans are cool, because I like to talk about the cool things they believed, which were always played second fiddle to all the insane shit they believed. So I just want to put that out there. But while Hooker's congregation lived in Massachusetts briefly, that policy, along with this, there was a religious schism around the teachings of a woman preacher named Anne Hutchinson and her subsequent heresy trial, which was this big controversy. It caused religious and, by extension, political schism within New England. That prompted him to uproot and head south, where he founded a new colony, which would eventually come to be called Connecticut.
Interesting.
Because of Hooker's views, the Connecticut Constitution was one of the most liberal in the colonies and would have the highest percentage of its population able to vote of any of the American colonies, all the way up until the War for Independence.
Damn. I wasn't aware of that. Like,
Yeah, and it had a secondary consequence. I don't know if you've ever looked at Connecticut on a map. It's a really small state. There's not a lot of land there. At the at the time that the Revolutionary War broke out, it was the most populous state in the colonies.
interesting. I wasn't aware of that. It's always interesting to find out uh, the circumstances around the revolution, because for certain reasons the American Revolution doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Yeah, because we leave a lot of important stuff out of the way we teach it in like public schools. Yeah, so Connecticut is where Ethan Allen is going to be born and raised. So you can kind of see like the kind of like radical environment that he was kind of raised in. It was very like extremely democratic, both like the Puritan ideas of like town hall representation and community policy making, combined with like the very uh, liberal suffrage that existed in Connecticut during his life. You could kind of see like how that could help shape a person's idea, like shape. You could imagine like a radical, somebody who fights against authority coming from that kind of environment.
Oh, definitely.
So Ethan Allen's ancestor, Samuel Allen, he was one of the first settlers in the Connecticut colony, and he settled in the town of Litchfield, Connecticut, which is where his descendant Joseph Allen and his wife Mary Baker gave birth to their first son, Ethan, on January 21st, 1738. Ethan was the oldest of 8 children, all of whom survived to adulthood, which was pretty rare back then.
Yeah, I'm kind of surprised 8 children survived that at that time.
Ethan had a pretty exciting childhood, to say the least. For some context, in the century following the colonization of New England, the influx of new settlers and the general trend of younger generations just being less religious than their parents meant that New England was becoming a bit less zealous in their worship. Puritanism was kind of starting to become like an old person thing. The New England governments were still ruled by the elect, who were also generally clergymen themselves, but they were starting to become a conservative minority within New England. And the Church of England, the Anglican Church, was starting to become a more prominent social force. Then, out of absolutely nowhere, you got this guy who comes over from England named George Whitefield. Whitefield was technically ordained as an Anglican preacher, but the way that he preached pissed off a lot of Anglican clergy. He was a new kind of preacher. He preferred giving his fiery sermons out in open air where thousands could gather to hear him, which hurt the delicate sensibilities of the Puritan conservatives who thought that preaching belonged in like meeting halls. On top of that, Whitefield was an absolutely amazing preacher. He was so good at public speaking. The way that he presented his message of fire and brimstone would rile crowds into a frenzy. There were reports of people who had like during like the high points of his sermons would start like pulling out their hair and like throwing themselves on the ground and having convulsions. They'd be screaming and crying and like normal stuff that normal people do, right? Hey, wait a minute, that's a weird thing that religious people do. Was that a shot?
Yeah.
Hell yeah. I love these rules. I'm glad that we're doing them.
Cheers.
Prost. So yeah, Puritans being Puritans, they thought that all of this like revivalist stuff was just devilry. They thought it was just demonic. So pretty soon, other preachers like Whitefield were all over New England, just all over the towns, all over the frontiers. They were drawing the largest crowds that had ever been seen in colonial America since Europeans got there. These were the biggest crowds that had ever gathered. Some of these sermons, some of these revivals and these sermons would draw crowds of like 25,000 people, which 25,000 people was larger than like 98% of towns that existed in colonial America. Like they would go out in the middle of nowhere and speak outside a town that had like 500 people, and they'd end up drawing a crowd from all over the region and have a total of like 25 or 30,000 people. It was insane how popular these guys were.
Yeah, that does sound insane.
Pretty soon other preachers like Whitefield were all over the place. This whole process, what's happening here, is what came to be called the Great Awakening.
I've heard of it. I've
Yeah, it's something that gets mentioned in like a paragraph in like middle school history books about the American Revolution, and then nobody remembers anything about it.
My school just taught brief glanced over it.
Something that doesn't get focused on enough in talking about the Great Awakening is the radical shift that it caused in New England politics. Because something to understand is that New England politics and New England spirituality were one and the same. When your meeting halls doubled as your churches, and your politics and your policies and the way that you decided made decisions for your communities were based on uh like biblical teachings, like a schism within a religious community is the same as a schism within a political community. And that's exactly what happened with the Great Awakening. The Puritan monopoly on political power in New England was broken, and public offices, both at the local level and at the colonial level, became split between the conservative clergy, which came to be called the Old Light, and these new, shall we say, evangelicals were called the New Light. I say I say that because George Whitefield was the founder of Methodism and of revivals, which eventually transformed into what's now modern day evangelicalism.
Lovely.
Yeah, it sucks. Um, Joseph Allen, who was Ethan Allen's father, he was an old light, at least at first. But eventually, Litchfield, where he was born and raised, found itself controlled by new lights in their congregation. The new lights were putting pressure on holdover old lights that were still in town to try and get them to convert. They would do everything from like be like that annoying family member trying to get you to go to church again to like outright harassment.
Just like that family member that tries to get you to go to church again.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. That eventually prompted Joseph to move his family out of Litchfield and move west to unsettled frontier in northwest Connecticut. That is a sip. The area where they settled down, along with other escaping old lights, became the new town of Cornwall in 1739 when Ethan was just 1 year old. So Ethan grew up learning how to build a new community from scratch. From his father, he learned how to build houses and barns, clear out arable land, cut trees, work wood, hunt, things like skills that you need to be a frontiersman, to be able to build a community out of nothing. While he was learning that from his father, he was also learning how to read from his mother, which involved reading and studying the Bible every day, of course. Ethan would grow up to become a prolific writer. He wrote autobiographies, political essays, propaganda, all on all sorts of topics. He was also really well read on scripture naturally because of the way that he's learning to read. Throughout his life, he would regularly incorporate Bible verses that he knew by memory into conversations in order to make certain points. The fact that he was so well versed in scripture would kind of be ironic later, but we'll get to that. Growing up, his closest friend was his cousin, whose father had died, and his cousin had come to live with the Allen family. His cousin's name, and bear with me here, it was Remember Baker.
That is weird.
His first name was Remember. Yeah, that's a weird name. That's a shot, right?
You right. You right.
Yeah, 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 yeah,
I hate that he lets you convince me to do that last one.
yeah. There's gonna be several more of those before this episode's over.
Cheers.
Prost. Yeah, so Remember Baker. I ironically remember his name because he's pretty important to the story. But yeah, Puritans had really weird naming conventions. They there's this joke. Have you ever seen the show Good Omens or Bad Omens or whatever?
I've heard of it. I've just never watched it.
It's a British show about an angel and demon who are friends and are trying to stop the apocalypse or something.
I think it's like supposed to be like Michael and Lucifer, or one of the major angels in Lucifer.
Yeah. Um,
That's what I gather from what I've seen. It's one of those shows that I've wanted to see, but I just haven't gotten around to it.
yeah, I think it was just like one season. It was pretty good. It was kind of funny. But there's a character that comes up who was a witch finder in like 17th century England, and it was based on like the Puritan sort of look, and his first name was "Thou shalt not commit adultery."
What?
It was just a joke on how like Puritans uh name like Puritans would just draw names from the Bible, and sometimes they're kind of like just random words like that. Also, his last name was Pulsifer, which is also a really weird last name.
Some people should not be allowed to name their kids.
This just to be clear, this was a fictional character. This wasn't actually his real name, but
Okay.
so on top of the struggle to build a town out of nothing, the people of Cornwall were facing another problem. That problem came in the form of a man named Reverend Joseph Bellamy. Bellamy was the head of the Litchfield County Consociation of Churches, which was a clerical body that managed the hiring and firing of ministers, which was very, very hypocritical because one of the foundational concepts of Puritanism was that communities would elect their own ministers. But they had this uh, independent like government body that was responsible for the hiring and firing of these ministers who were supposed to be like freely elected. So another example of Puritan insanity subsuming the actual cool stuff about Puritanism. Anyways, this guy Bellamy, he wielded his position with an iron fist. He was a new light, somebody who had been born again through the Great Awakening. Uh, and even he was in this position, even though Litchfield County was majority old light. So he was a new light guy with a very extensive powers over like community management, man, stepping into the business of all of these communities who were all old light. Uh, he cracked down very heavily on old light ministers all over the region. When Bellamy began coming for the minister of Cornwall, this guy named Reverend Solomon Palmer, Joseph Allen decided that he had had enough with Puritanism. Just he was just done with Puritanism, and he openly converted to Anglicanism when Ethan was 13.
That sounds like a ballsy move.
It was a very ballsy move because that basically meant that you could no longer participate in the government of your colony.
Oh, dang.
You had to be Puritan to have any sort of say in the way that your colony was run. But Joseph was just so sick of all of the sectarianism and all of the prejudice that was involved, like on both sides, both the old light conservatives, Congregationalists, and the new light conservative evangelicals, or the new light, the new light evangelicals. Both of them were just so smug and discriminated so much that he just got sick of it and he just converted to Anglicanism, and literally like was a big deal, but not just because of like what it meant that he was removing himself from like it was basically disenfranchising himself, but also like completely abandoning the entire reason that his ancestors moved to America in the first place.
Wow.
Which I know that doesn't like have any bearing on him. It doesn't matter to him, and it shouldn't. But like, kind of wild when you think about it.
Definitely.
So, Joseph was a pretty prominent leader within the community in Cornwall, and so the other families in Cornwall were pretty similarly sick of the religious schism that had all literally driven them all out of their homes. And so the whole town followed suit, including Reverend Palmer. They all converted to Anglicanism. Just this entire town, just completely taken out of the Puritan uh, socio-political system, just completely removed themselves. Despite all this work, to establish themselves in a new town, Joseph was starting to consider moving again. He had aspirations of becoming a land speculator, which was like he would. A lot of people were doing this at the time. They would buy colonial land grants directly from colonial governments. They would put in a little bit of investment to develop this land, and then they'd sell that land that's already partially developed for a profit to other people to come in and actually settle it.
Interesting.
Yeah, so that was really common. That's how a lot of people made money in early colonial America. He couldn't do that in Connecticut, though, because Connecticut by this time was the most heavily populated colony in British America, and there just wasn't any free land left to speculate on. It was all occupied. By this point, I think Connecticut had a population of 250,000
Damn.
compared to like Virginia, which uh, even if you include enslaved people, didn't which they didn't on their own censuses, but even if you include them, had populations of max like 100,000 with like 50 times more land.
Dang.
So Connecticut was very, very densely populated. So when Ethan was 15, Joseph applied for grants to land in the Wyoming Valley in northern Pennsylvania, and the grants were approved 2 years later in 1755. He was pretty much all geared up and ready to go. Then something wild happened. A British general by the name of James Braddock, with his aide de camp, Colonel George Washington of the Virginia militia.
I didn't. Sorry, Derek. I didn't realize Ida Camps. Well, you had talked about him on that. It was on the Alexander episode, I think, or maybe it was on the Frederick.
The Frederick episode, yeah.
I didn't think they lasted that long. I thought it was pretty much out by then.
Well, this is the same time period that Frederick was alive. Yeah, this is like 1755.
Oh, yeah. So for some reason, I was thinking it was like in that like 50 to 75 years before the U.S. But that's just because my brain doesn't know how to catalog time properly.
Yeah, this is like 2 decades before the Revolutionary War.
Okay.
Yeah. So, British General James Braddock, his aide de camp, Colonel George Washington of the Virginia militia, they marched to capture the French fort. It was called Fort Duquesne, which is settled where the city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, is today. But they were ambushed by French troops on their way, along with French allies amongst indigenous people. Of the 3,000 British troops in this expedition, 450 were killed, including General Braddock. This ambush signaled the start of an all-out war between Britain and France, which would eventually be enveloped into what we now call the French and Indian War. Was eventually enveloped into the larger 7 Years' War back in Europe, which was Frederick's great like Alamo moment where he actually won. Mentioning Frederick, let's take a sip. That signaled the start of an all-out war between Britain and France. Much of this war would be fought around the area where Joseph was planning to move his family. So that plan went right in the trash, at least until the war was over, which, spoiler alert, he didn't make it that far.
Not unexpected.
Yeah. As these colonial empires marched to war, Joseph was thinking about Ethan's future. It was obvious to his parents that Ethan was shaping up to be an intelligent and intellectual young man, if a bit belligerent and argumentative. Basically, he was shaping up to be like this very kind of a bookworm, very scholarly, very deep thinking. And in particular, Ethan was deeply interested in scripture and discussing theology. So Joseph decided that Ethan should attend Yale and should go to Yale and study to become a minister. which Ethan was actually like all too happy to. He was really happy with, like, that's exactly what he wanted to do. That was his interest. That was what he would like to do for the rest of his life. But before he could go, he had to do at least 1 year in a private boarding school before he would be able to pass the entrance exams for Yale.
Uh, how come? Is that like, did he not have the knowledge, or was that like a requirement?
Yeah, like Frederick, I'm doing it again. Ethan was Ethan never had, like, before the age of like 16, he didn't have a day of formal education in his life. So there were a lot of things that you need to know in order to get through like college at the time, that he just never had access to. And so, and also, to get into a college like Yale or Dartmouth at the time, you had to have a letter of recommendation from like a relatively well known graduate of the college. And the best way to do that was to attend a boarding school that was run by a graduate of that college.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Um, the problem was they lived on the frontier. There were no boarding schools anywhere near them because, they lived in the middle of nowhere. Like the largest town within like a day's journey by horse was like 1,500 people.
Jesus.
Yeah, it was sparse out there. So instead, there was this particular practice in frontier parts of colonial America where wealthy clergymen who were educated at some of these schools, like Yale or Dartmouth, they would take young men looking to go to college and let them live in their homes. And they would tutor them for like a year or so in order to prepare them for the entrance exams. The closest minister that was doing something like that happened to actually be a distant cousin of Ethan's. He was related by marriage to the Allen family. Uh, that was a man named Reverend Jonathan Lee, who lived in Salisbury, Connecticut, which was it was like 20 miles uh, from Cornwall. Incidentally, this guy also happened to be the son-in-law of the president of Yale. And so if Ethan were to go and study under this guy and got a letter of recommendation from him, it basically guaranteed that he would be getting into Yale. Because the president of Yale would see a letter of recommendation from literally his son in law and be like, oh, yeah, I trust that.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I just want to point out there's a lot of connections that are going to pop up in this story, that like this. This this guy Jonathan Lee was a distant cousin of Ethan Allen and was also the son-in-law of the president of Yale. That's gonna Stuff like that happened a lot in colonial America because basically everybody was related to each other one way or another because there just weren't a lot of people there.
That 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 kind of like tracks with what I understand pre-colonial America to be like. It was all about who you knew and whose back you could scratch.
Yeah, and there's a lot of examples of Ethan Allen, like, throughout his life, just kind of like not intending to, but just kind of stumbling upon people whose names are now like their faces are on dollar bills now. Just kind of accidentally stumbling upon them and becoming acquaintances with them just through like mutual connections.
Wow.
um, so yeah, in the fall of 1754, at the age of 16, Ethan rode off to begin his first bit of formal education. By all accounts, Ethan was an excellent student.
Before we get into that, how good was home education at this time? Like, I figured it's the primary. Like, was it good enough to like, on average for most people, was it good enough to like people who actually got educated? Obviously, not the people who just like, oh, I grew up on the farm. Was it good enough to do similar to this guy, or was it usually a lot worse?
There were usually like two. You either encountered one of two things. Either you grew up in a family that couldn't afford a formal education for their kids, and so they only grew up. Maybe they learned to read from reading the Bible with their parents, but everything that they would learn would be like practical skills for running a farm or building a homestead, something like that. The other side of that would be people who could afford formal education for their kids, and so their kids would usually either get like a tutor that would teach them like more advanced and like less stuff that was less important for like frontier living, like philosophy and mathematics and things like that, that would serve them well if they chose to go off to like a higher education like college. But there wasn't really much in between. So like an at home education, if you just like, what did you mean by like like home education? Like, do you mean?
I mean, people who were actually given the effort to taught. I don't mean just like, okay, back then obviously everyone was raised in their home, like you just didn't get that. But people who like an effort was made to teach them, they actually were able to teach them.
Yeah, if an effort was made to actually teach kids at the time, then it would have meant that they had the money to afford like a tutor. And so they would have gotten an education that would have prepared them for a life in like the upper echelons of society. So like business, politics, the clergy. Uh,
So basically, that was that divide you were already talking about. If they gave a shit, they would have had the money to give them a tutor and all that.
yeah, and like there were a lot of people who couldn't afford education, but still like encourage their kids to like read and kind of like expand their minds on their own in any way that they could, in the hopes that like that kind of informal education, like teaching themselves, would help prepare them for breaking into situations where they'd be able to advance themselves to a better life than just a poor farmer. But that wasn't the norm, and more typically, it was kind of this class divide. Whether you could afford, if you couldn't afford education, you really didn't try. If you could afford education, then you got like a comprehensive education that was very personalized and prepared you for a life in the upper echelons of society.
Okay.
So that's something that I don't think that I've really emphasized or that I've really like pointed out yet is the Allen family were considered kind of the upper crust of New England society. Not out of like their actual wealth, but their social status was definitely bolstered by the fact that their family came from like the original settlers of the colony, which means that in the eyes of general Puritan society, they were seen as the elect. And so they were kind of considered to be like upper crust, and that opened up opportunities for them that a lot of other like newer arrivals didn't really have. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
All right, where was I? Uh, yeah, Ethan was, by all accounts, he was an excellent student. His curriculum was extremely busy because he was having to learn a lot of stuff in just 1 year.
That tracks.
Yeah, so over the course of that year, he became well versed in the classics, yeah, like classical learning, like ancient Greece, ancient Rome, things like that. He learned basic French. He learned about math, philosophy, and geography. He was well on his way to pass the entrance exams and attend Yale. Like he was like a favorite of his teacher. This guy, Jonathan Lee. He was a really good student. He was a really thoughtful, like a teacher's dream. A student that was really thoughtful. A student that was really thoughtful and asked a lot of questions and was really trying to like pick apart the topics that they were learning about. Like he was a shoe in for Yale. But just as he was finishing up his studies, he received life changing news. On April 14th, 1755, his father died at the age of 46, which I don't know if you know anything about frontier living. Your father dying at the age of 46 is really bad.
Yeah, I can imagine.
uh, So, literally, just a few months before he was going to go off to college, he was forced to drop out of Reverend Lee's school so that he could take over the family farm. His dream of becoming a minister and a scholar was dead. Oh, yeah, somebody died. Let's take a sip. There's a story passed down in the Allen family, which the Allen family is still alive and they still live in Vermont to this day, which I think is pretty cool.
That's crazy, to be honest.
Yeah, there's actually a lot of them because they all had a lot of kids. But there's a story passed down in the Allen family that claims that at the funeral, just after they buried Joseph, Ethan stood by his grave asking his father to come back to life and tell him whether there really was an afterlife, whether there was a heaven after all of this. Because if there's one thing about Ethan that's like constant is that he, when it comes to spiritual matters, he's always questioning. Even like basic ideas like the existence of an afterlife, he was, according to the stories, he was questioning from a very early age. He's just 17 at this point.
That's young to be questioning.
Yeah, and he's sitting here begging his dead father to come back and reassure him that there is a heaven that he's going to after death, which sucks. That's really sad.
That's really sad.
Yeah. For the next year after his father's death, Ethan spent his time tending to the farm and mulling over the expenses left by his father, which included 200 pounds in debt, which 200 pounds doesn't sound like a lot by today's standard. But at the time, 200 pounds was the equivalent modern day of tens of thousands of dollars.
Damn.
His father was tens of thousands of dollars in debt when he died. And he was in debt because he was trying to get into land speculation. He had been buying up property all across Connecticut. Ethan briefly considered going ahead with the move to Pennsylvania, like his father had been planning. But he decided that his mother wasn't in good condition for a move. Because back then, a move wasn't as simple as moving your furniture from one house to another. He would have to completely start from scratch. And his mother would have a lot of responsibilities that he didn't think that she would be able to handle in her state. And so he decided against the move. They stayed in Cornwall. In the spring of 1756, the war was really starting to pick up. And there were rumors of raids by native troops under the French, which prompted Ethan and his cousin Remember to join the local militia. Their militia ended up being called up to service, and they were marched out north in order to reinforce British troops attempting to dislodge the French from forts along Lake Champlain. But after a week of marching, they received words that these forts had already been recaptured by British troops, and so they just turned right back around and marched back. It took them another week to get back home, having done nothing. So Ethan didn't see any war in his first foray into military service, but it was the first time that he would ever set foot in what would eventually become the state that he would help found, which was Vermont. They made it just barely far enough into what eventually became Vermont. And that was his first time seeing it.
Dang.
In 1761, at the age of 23, Ethan tried his hand at publishing his own writing. And that was because of some stuff that was happening back home in Cornwall. That minister that I mentioned, the minister of Cornwall, Solomon Palmer, had converted to Anglicanism. He had gone off to London, and he had gotten officially frocked as a preacher for the Anglican Church, as an Anglican priest. And he had returned back to Cornwall in order to minister the now newly Anglicanized congregation in Cornwall. But he was still being harassed by that piece of shit Bellamy, that guy I mentioned.
Lovely.
Yeah. Eventually, the public campaign that Bellamy was waging against him caused him to have to flee from Connecticut. It was just so intense, and anywhere he went in the colony, like he was ridiculed and reviled. And so he eventually just realized that if he ever wanted to escape it, he would just have to leave. This persecution of his childhood minister really pissed Ethan off. And so he wrote a pamphlet defending Palmer and arguing against many of the theological positions of the Puritan faith. Bear with me when I say this next sentence. This pamphlet was co authored by his younger brother, Haman, Heman, Haman, and their cousin, Elihu.
That's a name.
Those are two names.
Who the fuck comes up with this shit?
Okay. Do you want to count this as two shots or one? I'm fine either way. I'll let you decide.
I would say we keep the same rule as we do deaths. They came up at the same time, so it's one.
Okay. You're lucky I didn't bring up all of his siblings' names at once.
Well, it would all still be the same siblings. Like, you bring them up, it would come up at the same time unless they became relevant at different parts of the story.
But like if I had mentioned, like at the beginning when I mentioned he had 7 siblings, and I had named all of his siblings' names off, and we had to take a shot for each one, the only other person, or the only one of his siblings that had a normal name was his youngest sister, the 8th, which was Lucy. All of the rest were all biblical names that were just weird, just crazy, insane names.
Jesus.
Oh yeah, we gotta, yeah. Prost.
Cheers.
So his younger brother Haman and their cousin Elihu. In 1763, the war came to an end. Our old pal Frederick still ruled with his head still attached, and the British now ruled all of eastern North America north of Florida. Frederick mentioned, take a sip. So now that the threat of raids had passed and his father's estate was stable, he decided it was a good time to strike out on his own, and he decided to become a businessman. It was time for him to fulfill the American dream and get into business. He took a trip back to Salisbury, which is where he had gone to school under the Reverend Lee. And while he was there, he got this idea for a business venture. At the time, this is going to get into some weird economic stuff, so bear with me. At the time, there were 2 industries in America that were exploding faster than any other, and those were mining iron and producing potash. Have you ever heard that term before, potash?
Nope.
I had never heard that term before in my life before I started reading about Ethan Allen. Potash, or what we now call potassium, was a yeah, potassium. The name potassium for the element originally came from potash. And I'll explain. Potash was a chemical that was used in several industries in the British Empire, most notably the production of gunpowder. It was made by taking the ashes of burnt wood and leaching it, which I'm not sure what the process for leaching it. It's like something having to do with like pressing it, I think. But whatever the process was, it would leave behind these crystallized rock chunks, which were called potash, and these crystals were literally just pure potassium.
Interesting. Weird, but interesting.
Also, iron mines were starting to become a larger part of the colonial economy because as people were expanding into frontier regions, all of the land that was being cleared of trees was starting to expose iron ore veins in the ground. That was starting to cause a large influx of iron into the market, which was driving down the metal's cost. Also, I'd like to mention here, I thought this was interesting. One of the largest investors in iron in during this period was the Washington estate in Virginia. So George Washington's family were the largest investors in the development of the iron industry in colonial America. I don't know why I found that interesting. I just thought it was. So yeah, that was this influx of investment into iron mines was causing an influx of iron into the market, which was driving down the cost of iron. And the process of leaching ash in order to create potash required large iron pots. Do you kind of see where I'm going with this?
Not really.
This okay, I'll explain it. Ethan had this idea to open up a foundry in Salisbury, which would buy iron, which was now super cheap because so much of it was getting flooded into the colonial market. He would turn that iron into pots, and then he would sell those pots for a profit to these frontier settlers who were making money off of the production of potash.
Oh,
Yeah, so these two growing industries, he found the connection between the two. He rushed in and he filled that niche. So he got some investors together in a partnership and he mortgaged his share in the family farm at Litchfield. And he bought, or I put Litchfield in the script. It's his family farm at Cornwall. That's what I meant. And bought a forge that was already operating in Salisbury. And he became the principal shareholder in a full fledged business venture at the age of 24. Around that time, okay, well, I want to focus on that for a second. Like he, this is where the myth of like the America being the land of opportunity comes from. Like it's absolutely not true today, but back then, a 24-year-old could start like a wealthy business venture just by finding like the right little niche into obscure industries and just become rich off of it. Because this is how Ethan Allen, admittedly very.
well, so I would argue people weren't quite as entrepreneurial at that time. A lot of people had to focus on surviving. They had to keep the farm going or they had to keep this thing going. They couldn't branch out. But if they had the money to branch out, hell yeah.
I kind of agree with that and also disagree with it. I think it very heavily depended on what your background was, like economically speaking. If you grew up rich and you had like the resources backing you in your family, you had a lot of wiggle room in order to experiment with like business ventures and stuff. But if you're kind of just like you had to get here from England through indentured servitude, and you're just coming out of servitude, and all you had to your name was like your little plot farm, and you're just barely making subsistence. Yeah, I'd agree with that. But one thing that I kind of want to push back on is people were, even the most poor people in America at the time were very, very entrepreneurial. Like that is one of the defining features of American colonialism is entrepreneurship. It is what it is the bedrock upon which like American society is built. And it was intrinsic. Nobody came to America without the intent of becoming a rich business person. That was the entire point. Even the Puritans who were religiously motivated, they still came to America with the intent of becoming rich in some way, shape, or form. But yeah, I don't disagree with you. I get what you're saying, but like just I want to establish like
It wasn't just the people who had the money that were able to do it.
it's really complicated because um a lot of crazy stuff was happening back then. It was the Wild West before the Wild West, and people could become rich on a dime and then immediately lose it all and then become rich again. It was very fluid and very weird. It I've had too many shots in me. I have too many shots in me right now to like properly explain it the way that I want to. But just trust me, America back then was in this constant weird state of flux as far as like economics and class go that doesn't really exist today because it's so solid, it's so solidified. Um, I don't even know if I'm making sense anymore. I'm pretty far. I'm surprisingly far gone.
You're the one who added all the shot rules.
Which I don't get me wrong. I'm having a ball with this, but
You got so excited. We're back. We're back. I got to get some extra shots in.
oh yeah, I'm so happy to be doing this right now. I'm having so much fun. Anyways, yeah. Anyways, Around that time that he's getting his business started, he has also proposed to an old acquaintance of his, a woman by the name of Mary Brownson.
The way you said old acquaintance, were they not as close when he proposed, or what was it?
Hmm, I'll get to that. It's complicated and kind of disturbing.
Okay.
Um, they were friendly and they talked a lot, but I'll in just a second once I establish like how their relationship is, then I'll drop the bomb. So he had gotten to know Mary because her father was the owner of the mill that Ethan's father had sold their grain crop to. So whenever the Allen family would take in and would harvest a new uh, would bring in a new harvest of grain, he would send Ethan into town in Salisbury to sell it to uh, this guy Brownson who owned the mill, and his daughter was this woman Mary Brownson, and that's how they got to know each other.
Weird, but okay.
They were kind of a weird match for several reasons. For one, Ethan was a bit of a book nerd, but Mary was illiterate and not very interested in like really deep like philosophical topics. Like she didn't have an interest in politics or in philosophy or anything academic like Ethan was really interested in. Ethan,
That sounds like they shouldn't have been a match.
it's kind of weird because we don't know a lot about Mary. This is pretty. What I'm saying here is pretty much all we know about Mary. So yeah, so Ethan was a book nerd. Mary was illiterate. Ethan was constantly questioning religious doctrine. That was like his thing. And Mary was deeply and devoutly pious. She was a Puritan through and through. Probably the weirdest one, which this is the bomb I'm dropping. She was 6 years older than him.
What?
Now that wouldn't normally be a huge deal.
No, no. So what confuses me is, from what I understand, it used to be the opposite. The male was almost usually older.
Typically, but like I said, the colonial America was the Wild West before the Wild West. There were not enough people to be picky and choosy about the age of the people that you married, even if you were a man.
Okay.
But yeah, like I said, that normally wouldn't be a huge deal, them having a 6 year difference. But when they first met, he was 12.
What?
He was 12 and she was 18 when they first met.
That's creepy as hell.
When he was growing up, she was more of an aunt to him. And it wasn't until he got to like when he was running the family farm that it started to become something more like romantic.
That's creepy that they like. I'm not saying all 6 year gaps are creepy, but the way that they knew each other before is, in my opinion.
Yeah, she was literally a full grown adult when he was a preteen. Despite all their differences, she accepted, and they were married in July of 1762. Accounts conflict on how their marriage was. Some claim that it was a happy marriage, and others claim that they hated each other. And there's a whole bunch of people that claim everything in between. We really don't know because Ethan, despite how much he wrote about himself and his own life, didn't mention his own wife even once in the thousands of pages that
That's weird.
literally by the time he died, he wrote thousands of pages about his own life and maybe mentioned like once or twice that like he married his wife.
That is so.
Um, it makes me wonder. It makes me really Yeah, it makes me really wonder what was going on in their relationship. Was it just because he was really private about their relationship, which I would understand? Or was it like because he didn't like the relationship and didn't want it coming up in his life story?
I feel like even if you want to be private, you you still mention it somewhat. Like, I had a great day with the wife today, or this, that, and the other. That's so weird.
But for what it's worth, they would stay married for 21 years until her death. They would have 5 kids together, and they never cheated on each other. So that's something, I guess.
That I get what you're saying. but that's hard to prove that they didn't cheat on each other.
Uh, if as I'm going to establish in future episodes, there were a lot of people who really hated Ethan Allen and spread a lot of lies and slander about him. Not a single person ever mentioned him like being a womanizer or cheating on his wife. Which, if that were something that had happened, it would have come out in some way and it would have been mentioned. So I'm fairly confident when I say that he never cheated on his wife. For what that's worth. So, anyways, he gets married. The forge was running, business was doing great. The two of them settled down in Salisbury, and after their first kid, Lorraine, was born, he bought an enormous mansion for £500, which is literally hundreds of thousands of dollars in today's money. So, like, he is through this forge that he's helped set up and he's invested in and helped set up. He has become rich, like filthy rich. And oh boy, I forgot I put this in. He bought this mansion from a guy. Let me say this name real quick. Eliphalet Buell.
That's a weird name.
His first name is Eliphalet. Leiphalet.
That's another shot, isn't it?
Oh yeah.
I hate you, Derek.
I'm sorry, Dad. Prost.
Cheers.
Yeah. Ephelet Buell. He has no importance to the story. I just added it because it was a weird name.
Again, I hate you, Derek.
Please love me, Dad.
No.
Anyways, so his brother that we mentioned earlier, Haman, so we don't need to do a shot for that one. Haman came down to help him run the forge. And so like once they got the forge established, Haman came down, started helping him run the forge, which gave him some free time to start reading and to spend some time with his family. So it really seems like he's doing a really good for himself. Like, as far as life goes in colonial America, this is the best you could hope for. You've got money, you've got community, you've got free time to spend with your family, you've got a big house to live in, you've got a lot of nice land. I can't emphasize enough, it is absolutely gorgeous in Connecticut. It is beautiful, this area where he lives in Northwest Connecticut. New
It sounds like he's one lucky bastard, to be honest, even for today's standards.
Yeah, this is he has life made. He could live like this for the rest of his life and could have been like perfectly happy and content. But that just wasn't who Ethan was in the fiber of his soul and his bones. In both in his heart and in his heritage, Ethan was a man who questioned authority. He could never just sit down and live a quiet life as a businessman while the world around him was the way that it was. He became friends with the town physician, a man named Dr. Thomas Young. Now, anybody in the audience who's listening right now who's a little bit more in depth familiar with the history of the Revolutionary War, like not just surface level, but like knows a little bit about it, they're going to recognize this name. Thomas Young was a pretty big deal, even though he's not considered, like, he's not included in the names of like the founding fathers, but he probably should be because of how like prominent he was in the history of the American Revolution. And I'll go a little bit more in depth into like how important he was later, but for now, at this moment in time, he's just a Yale educated doctor with a lot of radical ideas. And he became kind of a mentor to Ethan. Just like Ethan, he's a guy that likes to rock the boat. The difference being that Dr. Young had opportunities to read radical Enlightenment writers like Thomas Hobbes, Alexander Pope, and Charles Blount, which gave him ideas. It gave his ideas a much more revolutionary, fine edge. So Ethan Allen and this guy Young were of a same mind. They were kind of like the same. They had the same personalities. They very much questioned authority, but Young had had like a formal, like a much more comprehensive formal education and been exposed to more radical like texts and media. And so he his exposure to these ideas was something that Ethan was really interested in, because Ethan at this point was still kind of, he was a country bumpkin. He didn't know shit. He was just a guy who was raised on a farm, who was kind of good at business, and but had always kind of questioned authority just because of the way he was brought up. And now he's being exposed to like the really in-depth political theory and economic theory and social theory that is like the cutting edge of questioning authority during this period of time.
So he's just like, I know nothing, but I'm getting told I got to question everything, or I want to question everything.
Well, he already questioned everything. That's just the way that he was brought up. His father was Joseph Allen, the guy who literally converted to say fuck you to the Puritan church. So he was already a guy who constitutionally was inclined to question everything. And now under under this guy Thomas Young, he was being exposed to like more in-depth thought and more intricate philosophy that contributed to this natural rebellious streak that he already had. And it would have really interesting consequences for the history of America. Thomas Young started to impart these lessons that he was more familiar with onto Ethan, who, to remind you, is only 26 years old at this point.
So he's another young, bright star.
Yeah, he's a young, naive child, basically, like our age, who has come into wealth just by like a natural business acumen, and is starting to, and who is like a natural rebel, starting to be exposed to like rebellious ideas. The idea that most influenced Ethan was Young's adherent, or not adherent, but like belief in an idea called deism. Have you ever heard of deism?
I've heard of deists, which I assume is what you call a someone who practiced deism, but I don't really know what the faith was.
Deism in really over, it's not really a faith. It's like halfway to atheism, basically.
Okay.
So deism, in really oversimplified terms, is the idea that there does exist a divine creator of the universe, but that the nature of that God, whatever it is completely unknowable to mortal people.
I mean, that doesn't sound wrong, to be personally honest.
Yeah, it's an idea that I've looked at a lot. Like, and I'm still not. I'm kind of agnostic. Like, I'm kind of the opinion personally that like there's no way for humanity to know whether or not there's a God. That's knowledge that's so far out of our ability to understand that we can never feasibly know it. But
See, like, I'm of the belief that there's no way we're the highest thing on the totem pole, even if we're not alone. Like, say other like races are roughly equal in like spiritual sense. There's no way we're the highest spiritually speaking. So there has to be some kind of quote unquote God. But do any of our religions have it right? Probably not.
yeah, like the way that I view it is that it's not it's not impossible that there is a being who created existence. Like, the fact that existence is a thing, the fact that things exist, is, when you really think about it, is a completely nonsensical state of affairs. However you want to, like, I don't know exactly how to word it, but like the fact that things exist is because nature naturally tends towards like everything from like the flow of water through a mountain to like the evolutionary process. Everything in nature tends towards the path of least resistance. Whatever helps whatever helps something get to its destination the quickest and the easiest is what is going to naturally occur within nature. And in the broad scope of existence, the idea, like, in the broad scope of like everything that could possibly be and not be, non-existence is the path of least resistance. Like the idea of existence, at least to me, seems like it requires a level of effort in order to jumpstart, in order to in order to be in like the philosophical sense.
That's the argument. It's the infinite probability equation. So, an infinite probability equation is that the numbers are so impossible to calculate, you either have to assume one end or the other. So, is life so easy to assume that we're definitely not the only ones out here, or is it so rare that we're probably just a freak of nature?
Okay, I promise I will get through the story. I promise I will get through it. I and I also I want to say for the record, I fuck I was kind of hesitant about this topic going into it because I didn't know if it'd actually be entertaining for like a podcast format. This is so much fucking fun to talk about. This guy is so interesting.
Like, I honestly didn't know that there was more to our founding of the nation. Like, I don't think about the founding of the nation. I just like I think of we had the 13 colonies, then we had the Louisiana Purchase. I don't think of that in between.
Yeah, it there's so much intricate politics that are going on within like individual regions and individual colonies that don't get talked about, but that were like hugely influential on the development that eventually led to the Revolutionary War. That uh, the Revolutionary War, in as long as I've been a history buff, the Revolutionary War has never held any interest in me. It's just never been interest. Like I would always, if I'm going for revolutions, I'm always going to like the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution. I'm never going.
Are you saying our revolution was kind of boring?
I used to think that, but in the process of reading about Ethan Allen, I have actually like I've developed a new interest in the American Revolution and all of its weird, fascinating intricacies that don't get properly appreciated in like modern, like the modern popular understanding of the history. It's it's so fascinating. It's so interesting. And it's really a kind of a failure on my part. I've just never really been interested in American history generally.
So I would argue that's kind of on American schooling because we focus so heavily on the American Revolution from a young age, even if we don't teach it properly, like we don't give it proper context or anything.
Yeah, like
But it feels like that's the major focus is the American Revolution. Like we're such biggity badasses that we did this, even though there's nothing unique about our revolution. If you, I mean, not literally, but like it's a revolution, you know?
yeah, two things I want to say. Like the first is in like public schooling, um the way that they set up American history to be taught in public schools is there's like three pillars to American history, and that's the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and World War II, and everything in between that, and everything in between those wars is portrayed as like setting up for the next war. It's a very
You're not wrong. Like it honestly focus like a lot of American history is focusing on the war or the build up to a war that I can like actually remember. I know there was other stuff in our history or whatever, but that felt like that was the major focus.
yeah going and I realize kind of that bias that I've got from my public schooling in my portray or in my understanding of American history is that going into this, I was kind of scared that learning about Ethan Allen, he was like a popular figure during the Revolutionary War, but he was kind of a minor figure. And so I was kind of scared that because that learning about him, he would be kind of boring because he only played like a minor role in the Revolutionary War. But then the more I learn about his life and like the context of the society that he lived in, it's opened up this whole new tapestry of American history, like colonial American history leading into the early United States that is just so fascinating and so interesting and so important to know about. And like everything that's happened in his life has like an important context around it that we should really be learning about that we just don't. And that's why I've in doing the research for this series, I've like done like a 180 on like my opinion of American history. And I'm definitely like from this point forward, I'm going to be doing a lot more reading on like other aspects of American history that I've been ignoring up to this point because of the way that like my public schooling has kind of conditioned me to understand American history.
It so it's really weird. We always acknowledge and say like, yeah, our American schooling is shit, but we never sit and think about the intricacies of how it's shit and how it screwed up our perception of our own history.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess a part of why I was so like averse to learning about American history was just because the way that we the way that I at least like I was always learning about American history was so influenced by just ideology and political interest
Nationalism.
and nationalism. Yes, I fuck just state for the record. I want you to keep this in the script. I fucking hate nationalism. Fuck nationalism. Fuck patriotism. Yeah. So he was teaching Ethan about deism. That's what we were talking about. Okay.
That's where our tangent started.
Yeah. Deism is yeah. So in a broader sense, he was embracing the found. So okay, basically, Ethan was being exposed to the idea that he believed in God. He believed that God was real, but also he thought religion was silly.
Mood.
So yeah, so yeah, that's fair. That's a fair way. That is a fair analysis. In a broader sense, he was embracing the foundational idea of Enlightenment thought, which was rationalism and critical analysis. That's what he was really being exposed to during this period. Soon, Ethan and Dr. Young were devising ways to turn their ideas into radical action by very publicly and controversially challenging a religiously based law. Around that time, there was an outbreak of smallpox in New England. In the mid 18th century, there was a rudimentary form of inoculation that involved cutting a person's arm. Bear with me, this is going to be gross.
I don't even understand how inoculation could work back then.
This is how it worked. This is how it worked. So they would cut a person's arm, and then they would take. So in the case of smallpox, they would take the pus out of the pox things that would grow on the pox sores that would grow on people's skin. So they'd find somebody who's already infected with smallpox, but who had like a minor case, and they'd take the pus out of their pustules that would grow on their skin. And a doctor would put that pus onto a piece of string, and then they cut like the person who's getting inoculated, they cut their arm, and then they take that piece of string and they'd run the string through the cut on their arm.
There's no way that worked.
It actually worked relatively well.
I
What would end up happening is that the person who's being inoculated, they'd have a brief period where they have a very minor case of smallpox that was usually not deadly, and then once they got past it, they would have a natural resistance to smallpox in the future. So it actually did like it was actually for medical science at the time. It was a huge improvement. It was a huge revolutionary step.
that still kind of sounds BS. Not lie.
It sounds BS. It sounds like it shouldn't. It sounds really dumb, but it actually it it wasn't perfect. There were a lot of people who who tried getting inoculated and then would just get the disease and die. That happened moderately regularly, but like 90% of the time, maybe 95% of the time, people who were inoculated like this would have like a very brief illness, and then they'd have like a better natural immunity to the disease.
That's so weird. Like it sounds like everything we know modernly. It shouldn't work.
Well, it was this practice was the basis for modern vaccinations.
Well, I understand that, but it doesn't sound. I. It sounds like you're just gonna get an infection from what you're doing, not actually significantly introducing your body to the virus you're trying to inoculate against.
Yeah, that you would think you'd think, but for some reason it was moderate. Like, again, I don't want to overstate like how effective it actually was, but it was moderately effective. Like, a bunch of the founding fathers got inoculated this way and survived to become the founding fathers.
Interesting.
As disgusting and unhygienic as it sounds, it actually worked relatively well. Like I said, the patient would come down with a minor form of smallpox, and when they recovered, they would have a greater resistance to the disease. But this form of vaccination was all but outlawed by Puritan authorities because Puritans had
Because it was witchcraft.
basically, yeah, they had this idea that vaccination was that they thought that diseases were God's will, and that God unleashing plagues on people was punishment for like sinful society, like a society becoming sinful. And so the thought of trying to prevent diseases from trying to happen in their mind was equivalent to trying to deny God's will. So in Connecticut, the only way to get an inoculation was if it was approved by town authorities, which it almost never was because town authorities were always very conservative, pious Puritans who thought that inoculations were blasphemous.
But of course they were.
Which I agree with. Vaccinations are an affront to God, and we should be banning them. That's just the rational position.
Go to jail.
On a Sunday afternoon, as everyone was coming out of the meeting house, they have church on Sunday. They're all coming out of the meeting house. Dr. Young and Ethan come up onto the steps of the meeting house as everybody's just coming out of church, and they call everybody and get their attention. So almost like a good portion of the town of Salisbury, which is about 1,500 people. As this crowd of literally all of their neighbors and friends look on in horror, Dr. Young cuts a small scratch in Ethan's arm and passes a string covered in smallpox pus through it. So, yeah, Ethan gets the inoculation in a place where it is illegal to get inoculated.
Lovely.
The entire town went into a frenzy over this. It was an explicit act of blasphemy. The town minister, who was actually Ethan's old teacher, that guy, the Reverend Jonathan Lee, that the Reverend and another of the town leaders named Peter Stoddard came by his home in order to arrest him. He threatened them both with a bullwhip, and he said, I added this quote because I love it so much. He said, quote, "By Jesus Christ, I wish I may be bowed down in hell with old Beelzebub 1,000 years in the lowest pit of hell, and that every little insipid devil should come along by and ask the reason of Alan's lying here. If it should be said, he made a promise that he would have satisfaction of Lee and Stoddard and did not fulfill it." So that's a lot of old colonial English that might not make sense if you're just hearing it. He's basically saying, so that term satisfaction at the end, the word satisfaction was slang in colonial America for a duel.
Oh, interesting.
So if you're saying somebody gets their satisfaction, it means they're getting a duel. And so basically what he's saying here, he's threatening these two city officials with a bullwhip and challenging them to a duel. And not only that, he is making an oath which is deeply sinful in Puritan belief. He's asking Jesus to cast him into hell if these two men won't duel him.
Wow.
I love this quote so much. In response to this, instead of arresting him for the inoculation, instead they arrest him for breach of peace. That's the charge they're slapping on him instead.
Sounds like bullshit charges, like normal.
Yeah, it is. It is bullshit charges because these. Keep in mind, these people are living in a theocracy. All of their law is bullshit.
True.
So his trial was very well attended because nobody had anything else to do in those days. Because his crime had been something that he had said, his defense was basically just creating plausible deniability for himself by using a little bit of clever wordplay. I didn't include what his actual, like what he said his actual defense was, because it really confused me and I couldn't understand it. And I was afraid if I tried to include it in here, then it would just confuse everybody else as well. So I didn't include it, but just like he used some like clever wordplay in order to justify his defense for why the thing that he said wasn't actually like blasphemous.
Basically, he bullshitted to the max.
Yeah, he bullshitted really well. He's actually kind of like Frederick in that he's really good at bullshitting because he's just really good at talking. Hey, Frederick, let's take a sip. Anyways, he used some clever wordplay to create plausible deniability in the idea that what he said to these two magistrates was actually heresy. The judge ended up finding him not guilty and he was let free.
Plausible deniability is our best friend.
Plausible deniability is our best friend. He was never put on trial for the inoculation. He never faced charges for that, even though that's what they originally went to arrest him for.
Hell yeah.
Even though he had won the case, his neighbors kind of started to treat him like a pariah.
I'm not surprised.
Yeah. It wasn't long before he was back in court. This time for. We're about to get into some true crime stuff. Let me tell you what.
This right up my alley.
Right up your alley. In a lot of colonial towns in British America, there was this continuous argument that was going on over whether people should be allowed to let their pigs freely graze throughout the town or if they should be penned up.
Pin your damn pigs.
Just pen your pigs. A neighbor of the Allens, a man named Samuel Tousley, or Tousley, yeah, I'll say Tousley. Samuel Tousley had repeatedly let his pigs out of their pens in order to graze. One day, one of them got into Mary Allen's garden and had eaten a bunch of her vegetables, which sounds kind of like cartoonishly innocuous, but you got to keep in mind those vegetables were like a good portion of their diet back then. If they didn't have those vegetables, they just wouldn't eat. Yeah, so it was law at the time. If a pig was caught out of their pens, then they would be impounded by the town's designated animal catcher, which was usually the tavern owner. And this fucking story, man. And the pig's owner would have to pay a fine to get it back. And that fine would directly go, because it was a perk of being the animal catcher. When the person paid a fine to get their pig back, that fine would go directly into the tavern owner's pocket.
Sounds about right.
You you were literally paying the tavern owner to get your pig back because you're too much of an idiot to just keep your pig's pin.
Wow.
And then that night, in order to drink away your worries about your pigs getting caught by the tavern owner, you'd have to give more money to the tavern owner to drink your fears away.
Sounds like a trap.
So, the Allens, both Ethan and Mary, what they did with the pig that got into the garden, instead of turning it over to the tavern owner, instead they just took the pig and they kept it in a neighbor's pen instead of giving it to the tavern owner.
To be honest, back then, if I caught someone else's pig eating my vegetables, eating my food resources, that's my new food. That's its replacement.
Yeah, you've replaced some like shitty, low quality vegetables with like some really high protein, fatty pork. Like that's a good trade off.
I mean, if you ain't gonna watch your animal and he's gonna eat my food, I'm gonna eat your pig.
So this guy Tousley, instead of just going to the neighbor and asking for his pig back, instead he reported Ethan to the justice of the peace, who is this guy named John Hutchinson, who also happened to be a friend of Tousley. Hutchinson charged Allen for failing to properly detain the pig in the legally designated pound.
Wow.
Once again, the courtroom was packed for the trial. Ethan argued that he had fulfilled his legal obligation by putting the pigs in a pen, even if it wasn't the designated pen. When Tousley challenged that, Ethan responded, quote, "One pig pen is as good as another," which, when he said that, it caused the entire room to explode with laughter.
Can you blame him? We're cracking up now.
Hutchinson, the justice of the peace, who was overseeing the trial, he got pissed off at this because he thought that Ethan wasn't taking the case seriously. He thought he thought Ethan wasn't taking this case about a pig being put in the wrong pen seriously. This is some of the funniest shit I've ever had to read.
This is a serious matter, sir. You didn't pin the pig.
He ended up ruling against Ethan, and he ordered him to pay 15 shillings as restitution. Ethan thought that was bullshit, obviously.
I can't blame the guy.
So he retaliated against Tousley by suing him for £2 that Tousley's brother owed Ethan. So Tousley's brother had at some point taken $2 from Ethan, and so now Ethan was coming to collect through his brother as like revenge for this whole situation.
That's some next level petty.
The crazy thing is Ethan won the case, and he got the £2. £2, which is £2 was literally worth like that's like $500 or $600.
Jesus.
And so he ended up coming out on top, having more money than when he started out. But as a consequence of this case, because everybody thought that this was that it was unnecessary and petty, he further alienated himself from his neighbors, who at this point all thought that he was like a blasphemous atheist. Both Ethan and Dr. Young were slowly being ostracized out of the Salisbury community. And on top of that, business wasn't doing too well at the furnace because, you know what happens after countries get out of the war? There's like an economic recession that typically happens with like big wars. Once the war ends, there's like this recession because production starts to go down.
You're not wrong.
Yeah, so the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, is just starting to end right around this time. And at the same time, there was a slump in demand for potash, and so he wasn't selling as many pots.
You're saying he was losing money?
He was actually losing money. By the end of this process, he was £1,200 in debt.
That's a lot of money.
It's the modern day equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of debt. Like it's closer in the modern U.S. dollar. It's the equivalent of it's closer to $1 million than it is to $500,000.
Jesus.
He was almost like the equivalent of $1 million in debt. Ethan was starting to think that it was coming time for him to take up stakes again and move to greener pastures. Dr. Young told him about some interesting land prospects that had just opened up. So now the war was ended, now France was no longer had a presence in Canada. And so the perceived threat of raids from native allies of the French into territories along the Canadian border were lessened. So because the French weren't there anymore, they didn't think that there was some white people pulling the strings telling the indigenous people to go and raid other white people.
So they thought no white people controlling indigenous people mean no indigenous people mad.
Right, yeah.
That's some horse shit. They should have thought.
It's some horse. Yeah, it's some horse shit.
You're stealing their land. They pissed.
But the perceived threat from raids was now lessened, and so people were now more willing to move into land and regions along the border with Canada. There was this particular strip of land just north of the Allegheny Mountains, which is kind of settled between Lake Champlain to the west and the Connecticut River to the east, where the forests were thick with strong trees and game. And the Young was telling Ethan about like this land and like the potential profit he could have from settling there.
Okay.
Soon after that, Dr. Young left town and moved back to his hometown of Albany, New York. So Dr. Young has now been effectively driven out of Salisbury.
That tracks.
Ethan tried his hand at some new business ventures. He ended up selling his enormous house that he and his wife had been living in for 2 years. And he also sold his share to the Iron Forge because profits had started to slump. But after the sale of his share of the Iron Forge was settled, Ethan realized that the amount of cash that he had been given for the sale wasn't the amount that they agreed upon. It was actually less.
Ooh.
But he got scammed. But the problem was he had already signed over the deed. And so legally, there was no recourse for him because there was no proof that they had agreed upon a certain amount.
This is why you get everything in writing, kids.
Yeah. So instead, he confronted the guy that he sold his share to in a tavern, and he ended up in a fist fight with him.
Not a gunfight?
Not a gunfight because they were all like just carrying around guns wasn't actually a really common thing.
Oh, interesting.
Everybody had guns for like hunting and like militia service and stuff, but just like having a gun on you was not a common thing, at least in New England. Down in the South, it was a very common thing because you never knew when a slave would try to kill you. But up north, like they didn't have a need to. Yeah, where was I? So yeah, he ended up in a fist fight with this guy, and once again found himself in court. And he ended up getting fined 10 shillings for assault. He started making plans to buy shares in a lead mine in the neighboring town of Woodbury. While he was preparing to leave for a trip to Woodbury just to like look at the mine and kind of and talk with some like business partners and the people that would be selling him the share, while he was preparing, he happened to run into the guy who cheated him, and this time that guy was with a friend of his. They got into an argument, and Ethan ended up getting into a fist fight with the guy's friend.
Wow.
A town constable came along, and they broke up the fight, charged all three men with breach of peace. They were taken to the courthouse, they were given a trial date, and then they were released. Later that same day, Ethan and this guy that cheated him ran into each other again.
God damn, how many times are they going to run into each other?
The guy who cheated Alan said something to piss him off, and once again they got into another fist fight. Twice in the same day.
It's on site at this point.
It is on site. This particular fight wasn't broken up, and Ethan and his posse made plans to leave town, continued their plans to leave town for Woodbury for this business trip. On their way out, when they were on their way to Woodbury, he got an official ruling from his old teacher, the Reverend Lee. And Lee basically said in this ruling that if Ethan left town, he was not allowed back in. It was effectively the municipal. So yeah, he got a letter from his old teacher who used to adore him, telling him that legally, if he came back, if he came back to this town, he would face criminal charges.
That doesn't surprise me. He was being a little bitch.
He was kind of being a little bitch.
So was the guy that cheated him, just for reference.
Yeah, it. The, everybody in this story are just little bitches. They're all bad people. He ended up actually after this business trip to Woodbury was done. He was able to return with. He appealed and he was able to return to town on a conditional dispensation, which basically said that he would be allowed to stay in Salisbury until his wife gave birth, because at the time Mary was pregnant with their second child.
Dang.
So she gave birth to a son, their firstborn son, and they named him Joseph.
How old were they?
This was 1765, so
Are they still in their 20s or 30s?
Ethan was 26 or 27, and so Mary would have been 33.
Okay.
So they stayed just long enough to give birth to their second child, and they named him Joseph after Ethan's father. They left to stay with some distant relatives of Ethan in Northampton, Massachusetts in the winter of 1765. The British government, let's do a little pivot real quick. The British government found itself deep in debt from prosecuting the war against France in the colonies.
No doubt.
Oh, no doubt, yeah. And a decision was made in Parliament that the American colonists should shoulder the weight of this debt.
Since we kind of started that war?
I wouldn't say we, because it was business interests between two colonial powers, and the people that were living there was kind of incidental. I'd still put the blame on just the colonial system itself. I wouldn't blame like individual people, like just living in America to shoulder the debt, because for instance, like American colonists made up the bulk of the people who fought in the French and the Indian War. The amount of regular troops from Britain that actually fought were relatively small compared to the actual number of troops total that Britain had.
I mean, colonies kind of fucked up the entire world. It screwed up the New World. It screwed up everything. It's why there's a saying, the sun never sets on British land.
Yeah, the sun never sets on the Roman Empire. Or the Roman Empire. Oh my god. So far gone.
Derek, go home, you drunk.
The sun never sets on the British Empire. But yeah, so if you want to take the perspective of the colonists, like, yeah, it was shitty and just kind of a power move to try and lessen the autonomy of the British colonies, which a part of me is like, yeah, that's wrong. That's like objectively wrong. A government shouldn't be doing that. And then on the other hand, like, indigenous people were kind of steading off to the side during this.
We shouldn't have been in America. Like, we shouldn't have colonized America. We took land. We fucked with natives.
Yeah, it's like the Six Nations people, the Haudenosaunee, or the Iroquois is what the white person name for it. They're called the Haudenosaunee. Like they ended up getting caught like right in the middle. Like their territory was literally along the Canadian border with New England. And they get caught right in the middle of this war and ended up having to take sides. And in the end, either way, they get screwed over, whether they were allied or enemies of Britain. So, like, fuck.
We screwed over the natives in many ways in our colonial days.
We're still kind of screwing them over, too.
You're not wrong. We have a lot more work to do if we truly want to make it up to the natives. I don't think we ever really can truly make it up to the Native Americans.
Deconstruct whiteness and create communities that live in communion with the natural world and forfeit European institutions like colonialism and capitalism.
Good luck getting America to agree to that.
I've got revolutionary hope, but I'm also very drunk, so who knows. Anyways, so yeah, the British government decides that American colonists should shoulder the weight of this debt. Earlier in 1765, Parliament passed a new tax on paper products, and it came to be called the Stamp Acts because the only way that you were allowed to use a paper product in any form, whether it be diplomas, contracts, playing cards, anything, the only way it'd be legal to use them is if they had a stamp certifying that the tax had been paid on them.
Wow.
Yeah. And keep in mind, there was a general like system of taxation that had been kind of practiced in the colonies up to this point. There's a system called the quitrents, which was basically like in most colonies in America, if you owned a piece of land, then you're required to pay like a regular property tax to the crown. And these taxes were called quitrents. But besides like that, they didn't really tax the colonies all that much. Definitely not as much as they tax like the home country. And so all of a sudden, this tax, which is not just a tax that kind of exists on the periphery of like just an intrinsic part of landowning or just an intrinsic part of like a tariff that goes along with trading. This tax affected everybody and it affected them in a deeply intimate way. Every time they had to use a piece of paper, they had to look at the stamp and know that they paid too much money for it. And as white as that sounds, it caused a lot of problems.
As most whiteness does.
So they passed this new tax in March of 1765, and it went into effect in late November. November came, and the ships came in to New York Harbor with the stamps that were to be distributed to the revenue authorities all throughout the colonies. While the Allens went into exile in Northampton, Massachusetts, the colonies were exploding nearly into open insurrection. Riots and mob violence against royal officials became a daily occurrence, much of which was prompted and organized by a secret underground society of Republican radicals called the Sons of Liberty. And that is all I have for this week. So, Tim,
Yeah.
what are your thoughts on Ethan Allen so far?
To be honest, I'm kind of surprised he's not more well known. Like, it seems like he had a role to play in the forming of our country, even if it's a bit not the same kind of role the founding fathers did.
He actually had a larger role than you would think just from what I've said.
And it's just amazing to think that we have so many historical figures that we really don't know about in America because it's not convenient to teach about them.
As a little spoiler, because I really want to say this, Ethan Allen bullied. You've heard of Benedict Arnold, right?
Yes. He's the big traitor of the Revolutionary War.
Yes, he's a big part of Ethan Allen's story. And Ethan Allen bullied out Benedict Arnold so hard that he betrayed the Continental Army. And
is he the reason why we have Benedict Arnold as like a term?
He is a large reason. He basically kicked off all of the chain of events that eventually led to Benedict Arnold betraying the Continental Army.
So he's the bully that took it a little bit too far?
Yeah. He didn't even take it all that far. Like he just told like the Continental Congress like, yeah, Benedict Arnold is a greedy piece of shit who takes all of the money you send him and spends it on his own stuff instead of using it for his men, which was a complete lie. I'll explain it more in detail when we get to it. It's really funny and really fascinating. But
so did he just like hate Benedict Arnold and just like, fuck this guy, I'm gonna spread rumors?
Yes, and there's a whole convoluted reason why, and it involves the opening battles of the Revolutionary War. We will get to it eventually. Anyways, is there anything else you wanted to say about Ethan Allen?
Not really. Just sounds like he's an interesting figure in history that I would have never heard about. Well,
unless we did this.
Even if we just stopped right here, he'd be really interesting on his own. It only gets more fascinating, like more.
So are you saying we've only scratched the surface?
We've only scratched the surface.
Interesting.
Probably by the end of the next episode, he will become one of the most famous men in America and one of the most infamous men in England. Yeah.
That's crazy.
What about do you have any thoughts about like colonial New England or colonial America?
Colonial America was just a bunch of pretentious pricks, personally.
It-
That's literally my impression of pre-colonial America.
yeah, that's the common thing that every founding father had in common was they were all pretentious pricks. I have definitely loved this story, the story of this guy's life, a lot more than I thought I would going into it.
You're like, hey, let's look into this guy. Oh, this guy's a badass.
He was a badass, but he did a lot of really cool, good stuff, and then he also like was just kind of a piece of shit in other ways.
I mean, what historical figure can't you say was a piece of shit, to be perfectly honest?
Every I guess I keep going back to this phrase, kill your heroes.
I mean, to be perfectly honest, we hold people to standards nowadays, but like, we're human. We're flawed creatures. It's easier to be flawed, especially back then when knowledge wasn't as easy to access as it is today. It wasn't as like they didn't have as many developments on information as we have today. I'm not giving them the excuse, but like I could say it makes sense why they were pieces of shit in the way they were.
Yeah, I can agree with that. It's a matter of like understanding people as a part of like larger trends of like societal development, if that makes sense. Tim, you got anything to plug before we sign out?
My Twitter, you can find me on Tim, aka Otis.
You can find me on Twitter at Visigoth. The I is a 1 and the O is a 0. I was actually looking through my tweets recently and I realized that I use a lot of academic language in my tweets and I should just shitpost more.
Lean into the shit posting.
Yeah.
Also, you can find the podcast social medias at the Alexander Society on both Facebook and Instagram, and on Twitter at Alex Society Pod. You got anything else today, Derek?
Nope, that's it for me. I'm just really drunk and it's really late.
I think you lost some of your tolerance. I'm not gonna lie.
I think I did too.
Because last recording, you were like boasting about your tolerance because like you were like, I'm doing good. Like I'm starting to build it back, and then like, bam, this happened.
I think it's just because I was just barely getting into like a rhythm of drinking, and then all of a sudden we go like a whole month without doing it, and then I come back and it's just all fucked.
You're not wrong.
Anyways, thank you for listening. This is the Alexander Society signing off.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a rate or review on your favorite streaming platform. Thank you and have a great day.